Before we get into this fascinating topic, we'd like to thank Wargaming for sponsoring our video. More importantly, we'd like to thank them for its free World of Warships game, which we've been enjoying whenever we get the chance. It's the perfect opportunity to take to the seas behind the helm of the world's best warships. This realistic PC game is available to play absolutely free, and you can get your version by following the download links in the description below. In fact, when you're ready to captain your ship and battle to victory, we can help you get started. Use our invite code to get 2 warships and 200 doubloons to help you on your way to becoming the commander of the seas. We hope you enjoy it. At the start of the 20th century, the comparatively young Empire of Japan was viewed by the West as being a major rational power in Asia, but not a real threat to the old imperial powers. But all that changed on May the 27th, 1908, when the Japanese fleet decisively defeated the Russian fleet in the Battle of Tsushima. Japan now had the respect of the world's militaries, and it was thanks to their battleships. Over the coming decades, Japan continued to build bigger and more advanced warships, with which it would continue to exert its power over South and Eastern Asia. In doing so, they often flouted post-World War I arms limitations treaties Japan had signed, such as the Washington Treaty, that aimed to limit the size of warships and the fleets they sailed in. Seizing territory in China and Korea in the 1930s, Japan began to attract the attention of the Soviet Union, and more importantly, the United States, who viewed Japanese expansion as a threat. As such, Japan began to tailor its warship designs for a possible war with the US, and as before, this included battleships. Fighting in China, the Japanese came to realize that while their forces were capable combatants, they were heavily outnumbered by the bigger countries. Japan was also especially aware of America's huge industrial complex and the wealth of resources afforded to it, and therefore, their plans for their newer battleships centered around them being extraordinarily powerful, so they could take on a higher number of less powerful battleships at once. Showing extraordinary foresight, the Japanese deliberately made the new battleships too big to transit through the Panama Canal, knowing that if the Americans built a ship to match it, it too would be unable to do so, adding potentially weeks for the American ship to transit from the American East Coast to the Pacific. Construction of the new ship, named Yamato, began on November 4th, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal under an intense veil of secrecy. Massive sisal curtains were erected to shield the work from the preying eyes of American spies, and the main guns were given misleading designations, intended to make the Americans believe they were less powerful than they really were. In reality, Yamato and its sister ship, Musashi, would carry 9 46cm guns in 3 turrets, the most powerful guns ever fielded by a surface warship. The stats of Yamato were staggering by any standard of the day. Under full wartime conditions, it displaced over 71,000 tons, compared to the Iowa-class battleships, then being delivered to the US Navy, which came in at over 57,000 tons, and were armed with 40.6cm guns. From stem to stern, it was 862 feet long, only 20 foot shorter than the Titanic, and was powered by 12 boilers that produced over 150,000 horsepower. At launch, the Yamato boasted up to 25 inches of armour in key areas, although this would increase during the war. When it was finally unveiled, the Yamato captured the hearts of the Japanese people, while at the same time generated consternation amongst the US Pacific Fleet commanders, who were finding their resource increasingly being diverted to the Atlantic Fleet in anticipation of war breaking out with Nazi Germany. Yamato began sea trials in October 1941, 2 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The trials revealed this naval behemoth was capable of a respectable 27 knots, although this was slower than the American Iowa class by 6 knots. On December the 16th, the need for battleships to enter the fray against the Americans quickly saw Yamato pressed into the frontline service ahead of schedule, joining the fleet with less pomp and ceremony than perhaps such an impressive ship deserved. Even at this early stage, however, questions began to linger over just how effective the super battleship would be, given the nature of the war at sea. In the Atlantic and Mediterranean theatres, the powerful British fleet of battleships had sustained painful losses in the face of enemy aircraft and submarines. The Japanese themselves had severely damaged the American battleship force at Pearl Harbor with aircraft, and would do so again at the Battle of the Coral Sea later on May 8, 1942. Nevertheless, the Japanese remained confident in their new battleship. Only time would tell how much of an impact it would have on the fight. On February 12, 1942, Yamato's prestige was affirmed when it became the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor, and was now planning to destroy the American fleet at the island of Midway. On May 27th, supremely confident of victory thanks to Japanese successes thus far, Yamato sailed from Hiroshima Bay with the rest of Yamamoto's battleships to join with their carrier forces for the attack. However, behind the scenes, events were conspiring to scup Yamamoto's ambitions. The Americans had not only broken Japanese codes, but were actually deciphering them faster than the Japanese could, and as such, they knew the fleet was heading to Midway. The element of surprise was lost. For Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto commanded the battle and split his forces in two. One force consisted of the carriers, and the other of the battleships. His aim was to lure the Americans into a trap with carriers on one side, and Yamamoto and the battleships on the other. However, the Americans located and decimated the Japanese carrier group, while Yamato and its comrades found that they were too far away to render assistance. It was a decisive victory for the Americans, and the Japanese would never fully recover from the loss of the carriers. Their loss also made the Japanese even more reliant on their battleships, so it was with some relief that Musashi was completed on August 5, 1942. Before the war began, work had also begun on a third ship, known as Shinano. However, it was halted at an early stage after the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the destruction of the Japanese carriers at Midway, work was started on turning the Shinano into an aircraft carrier. A fourth ship was planned but cancelled. Musashi would have the unenviable task of returning Admiral Yamamoto's ashes to Japan, after he was killed when the plane carrying him was shot down by American fighters on April 3, 1943. With air power being the dominant factor in many of the surface engagements of the Pacific theatre of war, both Yamato and Musashi were unable to be used in the fashion they were designed for, and operating out of the Japanese base at Truk in New Guinea throughout 1942 and 1943, their crews had a frustrating start to their war. To even further dent their crew's pride, they found themselves regularly being employed in delivering fresh troops and supplies to Japanese garrisons and bases, becoming essentially very heavily armed transporters. During 1943, the super battleships also had to contend with the persistent threat of ever larger numbers of US submarines that had begun stalking the Japanese fleet like sharks amidst a feeding frenzy. Yamato would experience the potency of the US submarines firsthand when on December 1943 it was torpedoed by the submarine USS Skate, damaging but not sinking the mighty battleship, which limped back to port for repairs. Over 3 months later, it was Musashi's turn, being torpedoed by the USS Tunney, although again the battleship was able to return to port for repairs. Reflecting the nature of the war at the time, the repairs afforded the Japanese the opportunity to dramatically increase the anti-aircraft armament aboard both battleships. Yamato and Musashi also took advantage of the close cooperation between Germany and Japan, and was fitted with German-designed radar, one of only a few Japanese ships to have such equipment. After supporting operations at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Yamato's only action was a friendly fire incident involving a Japanese plane, the two ships were finally able to operate in the role they had been designed for. When, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, after the US carrier task force had been successfully decoyed away, Yamato led a force of battleships and cruisers through the San Bernardino Strait to attack American ships offloading troops to the shore. However, the Japanese force was being slowly eroded by American air and submarine attacks during the whole transition, which greatly reduced its impact on the American fleet when they finally arrived. Soon, the American air attacks began focusing on Musashi, which sustained up to 19 direct hits from bombs as well as a number of torpedo hits. That much damage was too much for any ship, and Musashi sank on October the 24th, 1944, after a brief engagement during which Yamato scored hits on the escort carrier USS Gambler Bay. Counterattacks eventually forced the Japanese commander to retreat prematurely. The Americans lost 3 destroyers along with the Gambler Bay in the course of the fight. The surviving Yamato was again returned to port for repairs, and an even greater number of anti-aircraft guns. It now had nearly 7 times the anti-aircraft armament it had in 1941. On March the 19th, 1945, Yamato was back at Kure when it got caught up in a major air attack by the US Navy, although the damage inflicted was light. By now, the once mighty Japanese fleet was a shell of its former self, and when American forces landed at Okinawa, Yamato and several other ships were assigned to intercept them in what was seen as a suicide operation, aimed to inflict as much damage on the Americans as possible before they themselves were destroyed by enemy fire. The plan ultimately failed, as the Americans intercepted them before they could reach Okinawa. Over 280 American aircraft swarmed over the Japanese ships, bombarding them with bombs and torpedoes. 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs impacted on the Yamato, and at 1420 hours on April 7, 1945, the vessel began to roll over before an internal magazine exploded. The Yamato sank, taking nearly 3,000 of the crew with it. No one could argue that the Yamato and Musashi were anything but incredible feats of engineering. They perhaps represented the ultimate examples of the World War II battleship, but they were built to an outdated concept in naval warfare, and like the knights of old, when confronted by newer weapons, they found their time had passed. As for the Yamato, that never was. When the Shinano was completed, it was the largest aircraft carrier in the world, displacing over 61,000 tons, but its career was short. Beginning sea trials on November the 19th, 1944, it was torpedoed by the submarine USS Spadefish just 10 days later. Nevertheless, it would hold on to its title of being the largest aircraft carrier ever built, until the nuclear-powered USS Kitty Hawk was commissioned in 1961.